way. Gotta group some thoughts. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining. This is the fourth Salon of the Protocol Symposium on Plurality in Practice with Ben Busch and Rich McDowell, who'd be talking about their summer project, which was one of our orienteering grants and an experiment in plural voting protocols. So thanks, guys. It's been great having you this summer, and take it away.
Microphone on. Thanks, Timber. Can everyone see the slideshow? Yeah. Yeah, so hi guys. So as Timber said, we're Rich and Ben. We had a protocol orienteering grant focused on plural voting mechanisms. This was a particularly sort of broad project looking at the whole design space of plural voting mechanisms, including a few case studies. So it's particularly broad and has a frankly alarming number of slides. So I'm going to be rushing a bit, but hopefully we can get through everything. So yeah, our goals in the protocol orienteering grant were to assess plural voting mechanisms from a practical standpoint. There's been a lot of sort of theoretical analysis of these, but we think these are some of the first sort of quantitative analysis. We were going to assess the risks and rewards of implementing plural voting mechanisms compared to the alternatives, and hopefully create some guidelines to help people who are implementing these mechanisms calibrate them to their specific contexts. That was the goal. What actually happened? Well, we ran our own plural voting experiment back in May, and then some smaller votes throughout the summer. We did find an issue with the standard implementation of COCM, which we'll talk about later, and we proposed an improvement, even though we weren't supposed to be particularly improving protocols. We did have to make that fix. We also looked into practical and statistical challenges with Polis, which is a commonly used voting and deliberation and discussion tool. We also looked into certain plural approaches that are being used to address the stagnation in DAOs in the Web3 space. And then we tried to bring it all together with a set of guidelines that connects all these things. To start briefly, I'll try and address what is plurality. Plurality, and that's the plurality symbol, which you'll see on the book by Audrey Tang and Glenn Weil and the Plurality community, of which I'm a contributor. It's a movement encompassing a broad range of technologies, protocols, approaches, and disciplines, which is kind of waffly. In general, everyone that talks about plurality tends to have their own definition of what it is and what it isn't. Common ways to talk about it are acknowledging and harnessing differences, collaborating across divides. Vitalik Buterin, co-founder of Ethereum, yesterday in Ethereum, he was talking at the Network State conference. He often talks about plurality in contrast to network state approaches, particularly strong exit rights, which aren't super intuitive unless you're into network state stuff. But there are basically as many ways to talk about plurality as there are people that do plurality. It's often defined in contrast to other approaches to what's called megapolitics. These terms come from Civilization 6, the popular strategy game you see on the right. Plurality tends to be aligned with the digital democracy concept and is put in contrast with synthetic technocracy and corporate libertarianism. Plurality can also be often used, it's sort of visualized as a way to navigate various intersecting hierarchies of our own identities. We contain multitudes, as people say, and it can be very hard to understand how these interact and design protocols and mechanisms that properly account for all of these interactions. To sort of bowdlerize the old saying, I don't have a definition for plurality, but I know it when I see it. It tends to have a vibe rather than necessarily be very precisely specified. There are, however, quite a lot of examples, which I think people clearly agree are pluralistic examples. Taiwan tends to be the canonical example that people use. In 2014, the Sunflower Student Movement occupied Taiwan's legislative chamber for a long time. Audrey Tang, who then went on to be the Minister of Digital Affairs for Taiwan, calls this a demonstration rather than a protest, because she says they demonstrated a better way of doing things rather than just protesting the way things kind of were done at the time. Various sort of in-person and digital approaches to try and harness the conversation of really an extraordinary number of participants were used at the time with some success. On the right, we see one of the first successes of the V-Taiwan citizen engagement movement, where Polis, a tool we'll talk about a bit later, was used to help set the regulation for to mediate a dispute between Uber drivers and sort of licensed taxi drivers. Another fairly common example is Twitter's community notes. The Twitter community note algorithm is one of the things that people generally agree is quite successful about later iterations of Twitter. It works by trying to surface the notes which are voted as the most helpful by the most polarized voters. So it has a fairly complicated architecture in the back end and algorithm to assess users by their how polarized they are on what ends up being a sort of left-right political spectrum, although that's not hard-coded. And the note which is voted the most helpful is the one that's intended to be shown. This idea of bridging across these tribal divides is a very common concept in pluralistic mechanism design. Another sort of less fancy and advanced example is the European Council. The European Council has sort of a weighted voting system which is used to inform a sort of middle type of majority, qualified majority. In this, each member state is given a weighting based on its population, and a qualified majority is reached if 55% of the member states vote, which represent at least 65% of the population. This idea of weighting votes so that all votes are equal is another common thread that we'll be retained to a lot. I see I've added a nostalgic diagram of this, which still has the UK with its 15% vote. Alas, we have 0. In general, I want to stress that there are just a lot of success stories here. Participants in these protocols consistently report positive experiences. The implementers consistently report that the experience has been positive, engagement is high, results are useful. Participants often, after participating in Plural mechanisms, they report improved opinions of the institutions which implemented them. Something is obviously going on here which is successful, but there has been quite a limited analysis of whether this is inherent to the mechanisms and mechanism design or some other factor like novelty or transparency or things like that. And I do want to stress the success here because, because a lot of things are sort of going to conspire in this, I think, in the presentation to seem a little bit negative. We've done a lot of analysis of which might come across as nitpicking. I have had quite a rubbish time, frankly, for personal reasons for this summer. So I'm in quite a negative space. It's like 2 a.m. here, and also I'm very English. So when I try to be earnest, it comes across as sarcastic. But I want the thread to be like at the base here. Plural mechanisms are great. This is the future. This seems to be better than the alternatives, but it is worth analyzing how we might be able to do better. But as implementers of these participants in these protocols. And one reason why the success might be happening in spite of the mechanisms, and it might not matter, is that, and Audrey Tang, the digital minister for Taiwan, mentions this quite a lot. Most of the successful examples that I've mentioned come on the left-hand side of this double diamond design, where we're mostly interested in discovering and listening and like setting future agendas and not actually making decisions and implementing them, which is why voting mechanisms are particularly interesting because they don't necessarily sit in this position. When we vote on something, it's often because we have a decision to make. We want to take some decision, and often we maybe can't even reach a consensus. So the consequences of getting that wrong may be higher. But what are plural voting mechanisms? These are a bit better defined. Plural voting mechanisms, they consider the relationships between voters and weight votes based on how correlated the voters are across some dimension. These weights are generally discounts. So what happens is your vote will be reduced based on your correlation with other voters. This is often positively reframed as a bonus elsewhere because people don't like their votes to be discounted. They feel bad, but that is almost always what is happening is with things being discounted. The goals of these mechanisms include limiting the power of major vote holders, acknowledging differences, and surfacing the option with the greatest breadth of support. These aren't necessarily new, although we'll be focusing on sort of newer iterations of this. The US Electoral College is an example of a plural voting mechanism. Voters within the US have their votes weighted depending on where they live geographically. People can argue that this is a very badly calibrated pluralistic voting mechanism, but it certainly is one. We will be focusing on connection-oriented cluster match a lot in this talk, which is a mechanism that compares groups of voters based on particular identity characteristics they have, and these are often imposed by the implementer, which dimensions matter. We also might briefly, if we have time, touch on pairwise voting, which is an attempt to make these correlations intrinsic to the mechanism by focusing on the results of prior or simultaneous votes. But we, earlier in the year, were implementers of a plural voting mechanism. We built a tool to facilitate plural voting via the COCM mechanism, which we'll talk about how that works a bit later. If you participated in some of the votes for the follow-up grants for the PIL projects, you'll have seen this tool we built. The goal was really to make a tool which could hide most of the complexity of this mechanism and really make it as easy as possible for participants to register, tell us the information, the relational information and identity information we need to take those groups, to run them through the mechanism, to help have a clear pipeline from discussion to voting options, etc., etc. And then automatically calculate results. COCM, as I explained briefly, it works by taking participants in a potential vote and grouping them into various groups based on data that they provide or that you derive from the mechanism. Participants are assigned a certain number of voice credits, which are their votes. Votes that come from voters from different groups on the same option, they carry more weight than those from within the same group. So two people from the same organization or two people from whatever identity dimension that you've decided to correct for will have their weight, their voice reduced slightly. This results, hopefully, in bridging bonuses for the vote options supported by participants from the widest range of groups. That's the intent, but how effective are these bonuses and do they justify the complexity and calibration effort, which is actually quite considerable. Some quick definitions. A dimension is an identity characteristic used to divide participants into groups. So where you work, your gender. A group is a set of participants with a shared identity characteristics. You might work at the Ethereum Foundation, so you'd be in the Ethereum Foundation member group. The formula the COCM formula doesn't particularly, it doesn't have an opinion about dimensions. They just treats all groups as separate groups, but as it's quite helpful and intuitive to think about dimensions as an implementer of these protocols. As in general, multiple, if once you have multiple dimensions, people can be in multiple groups, and it's there that things get complicated and interesting, and also sometimes break. The particular experiment that we ran was the plural MEV experiment. MEV is a particularly fraught research topic in Web3 crypto space, and MEV researchers were invited to an in-person event where they were, it was an unconference, where they were to allocate grant funding to collaborative MEV research. So they turned up, they proposed topics they felt were worthy of research, they combined into new research groups, and then they voted on which proposals should receive funding. Part of the deal to get people to turn up in person to this event was that it would be private, and everything said there wouldn't be published except the results. But the tool allows for anonymized analysis of the results, and some things can be shared. When we set this up, the goal was really to distribute these grants, but by the time we ran it, we had received this grant from the Ethereum Foundation, and so there was more of an incentive to try and design this experiment to learn some things about the mechanism. But designing experiments around voting mechanisms is difficult. Firstly, you can't really run an experiment unless people are voting on something that they care about, because they just won't necessarily share their true preferences. There was quite a large amount of money to be distributed, so that wasn't a problem here. But the main issue is that it's just very hard to do anything like double blind testing or simulate counterfactuals. Like, how would people have voted if they had different amounts of votes, or the mechanisms were changed, or if we used different identity dimensions, or even if different participants showed up. Plural mechanisms are so contextual based on the identities of the participants that as soon as you change things, it's really very hard to compare the results. Nevertheless, we chose two identity dimensions: professional affiliation and the groupings output by an instance of Polis that we ran or intended to run during the event. And each participant had the same number of votes for each of the votes. Separately, and not particularly broadcast to the participants, we gathered extra data to facilitate simulating different grouping combinations. We pre-declared which ones we would use to allocate the grants, but we wanted the possibility to see whether the results would have changed if we had chosen different ones. We also gathered academic credentials of the participants to see what would happen if we simulated the effects of weighting people with different levels of expertise differently. The assumption there was that if we weighted their votes uniformly differently, we could assume that they would generally vote the same. Actually, what's often proposed is that people who with higher expertise are given more votes to allocate, but in that instance, it's very hard to assume that they would allocate them in the same proportion as if they had less. Generally, data suggests that people with a lot of votes to allocate tend to spread them quite widely, especially if they have several left that they just don't want to waste. And returning to the sort of theme that I want underlying this, it was very successful. The tool worked well. We allocated all the money. No one seemed to try and manipulate the results in any ways that we sort of imagined they could. The goal of producing diverse research collaborations was definitely reached. I mean, we had collaborations across affiliation boundaries and also across sort of status boundaries. We have researchers collaborating with founders of enormous blockchains and other interesting combinations, which is what these mechanisms are designed to encourage. I can't share specifics, but hatches were buried. People turned up to this that literally hadn't talked to each other in months because of disagreements. And like with the other examples that I shared, people generally reported that it was enjoyable and inspiring and useful. But it didn't go especially smoothly in some regards. Polis didn't produce the groups that we expected. And as the implementers, we had to make quite a lot of manual interventions to user identity data. Most of these errors, people had selected the wrong thing from the list, or typos, or people were allowed to enter, they were allowed a free-form text entry, which we then confirmed and added to a drop-down menu. In some cases, people would enter what was clearly supposed to be the same affiliation, but because they spelled it differently or formatted it differently, that it got temporarily processed as two different affiliations. These changes were, I think, largely uncontentious, but they still had to be made. More contentious changes that we had to make were people asserting that they had no affiliation when they quite clearly did, and just general approaches to the problem in Web3 of what organizations are distinct and what should be treated the same. And again, the same question that I posed earlier, that we wanted to analyze to what extent were these successes interested in the mechanism? Did COCM produce these wonderful results because of any particular property of itself, or did people turn up because they're new and exciting? Could we have basically just run quadratic voting and produce the same efforts, the same results with much less effort and much less gathering of information data from people who are really quite private? And with that, I'll hand over to Ben, who did much of the analysis for this.
Let me just share. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Yeah, so I go a little bit about the analysis and basically a little bit more deep into the model. So basically kind of the decision that we faced when we implemented the COCM model in particular. But let me start with a brief overview of quadratic voting, right, which is the current state of the art, where these Plural mechanisms tries to improve upon. And a quadratic voting mechanism, I mean, this is a classical figure that is often shown that here on the left extreme, right, if you have a vote and you say like you can buy as many votes as you want, depending on how much money you have, then the person who values a particular public good a lot can purchase as many votes as they want, and therefore insert a large influence. This might be suboptimal, which basically means that the ones with the most money get to basically to decide the vote. On the other extreme, you have one person, one vote, is where people who value a given good a lot, much, cannot really express their preferences because they only have one vote. So they get as much vote power as people who don't value this public good, for example, so much. And quadratic voting is like the attempt to balance these preferences, that people who are very interested in the good can purchase more vote power, but not so much to basically dilute the vote of everybody else. There are known downsides of quadratic voting, like for the most prominent one is civil issues, that given these square rooting, you have an incentive, for example, to split your token balance between multiple accounts. There can be collusion, meaning private agreement between voters to vote on a certain outcome, and as well, because there's usually no identity data collected, there's no consideration of voter attributes for, like, for example, financial, cultural, or political, which can lead to suboptimal outcomes when like-minded voters converge on the decision, for example. Okay, plural voting. On the other hand, we look at the model, and this is the model that we implemented in the software that Rich was talking about. We implemented the model of Miller et al. 2022. And basically what you do is you consider aspects of voter identity. So you collect identity dimensions, like in our case, like which presented earlier, research affiliations of where the people work, so company affiliations. Then we generated these research groups, and we also generated the policy dimensions ourselves. And basically, we tried that to solve some of the downside of quadratic mechanisms. For example, if we know the voter identities and only the people with the identities that we can verify vote, then there's no problem of civils. And given that we have these identity information, we can mitigate or even in theory eliminate some of a collusion of voters. And like Rich said, these more probable approaches show promise, but have not been tested and validated in practice, and that is exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to implement and validate this model by our experiment, but at the same time, we wanted to learn from it and see what are the downsides or advantages of doing so. First, let me guide you through a little example to get your sense of what actually this, Rich was talking about bridging bonuses or discounting, how this actually would look in this very small example in reality. Here, consider these 5 voters, right? We know their identities, and there are 2 options where you can vote on. Assume that voter 1, 2, 3, they vote for option 1, so the option 1 has total votes of 12. Imagine voter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 vote for option 2. And option 2, even though more people are voting for it, but they will allocate less votes to it. So option 2 has just votes of 7. So according to this measure, option 1 is better than option 2. So option 1 should be implemented. If you do quadratic voting, you would get the same results. Remember, voter 1, 2, 3 voted 4 for option 1. So it's the square root of 4 times 3 is 6. And for option 2, it would be 5.8. So still under quadratic voting option, in this example, option 1 would be preferable to option 2. Now, in the COCM model, imagine we would know that voter 1, 2, and 3 are actually in the same group. Let's say they work for the same company, so we assume that they have a private agreement on what they should vote for, and we know that voter 4 and 5 are also in the same group. In that case, if we can, if this assumption holds, and we know this, then basically in this case, option 2 would be preferable to option 1. And why is that? If you look at the votes for option 2, you can frame it in 2 ways, like either like a more diverse crowd votes for option 2, in this case, even though it receives less votes than option 1, because 2 voters from 2 distinct groups vote for it. You can frame it as this, or you can frame it as these discounts that basically the voter 1, 2, and 3 who agreed to vote more on option 1 get a discount for doing so. And that is basically what COCM is able to produce, taking this identity information about these groupings, like here the blue group and the green group, to adjust the votes and have the power to turn a vote in the end. So this is the formula. Just wanted to show you the slide that this is the formula that works in the background of the software, and that also I used to compute in this little example. So that's very complex formula, and basically, but what is very important actually, what we figured out during the experiment, it's very important that actually people understand the formula behind the vote. And so a challenge for actually the first challenge for implementation of a COCM model is that you need to be able to explain the people that should vote according to this formula what the formula does. And that is actually a first challenge of implementing these plural mechanisms, which in the background are quite complex into these using that as a model. But what I want to go into today is not just I said to you, like, COCM prevents, for example, using identity data to prevent civil issues and also potentially mitigate collusion between participants. But what do you need to have to ensure these properties? So the first assumption that is when you have COCM is that the implementer overseer of the vote guesses only the grouping dimensions relevant to the vote. Like we said earlier, for our experiment, we gathered company organization affiliation, research groups, and we also gathered polis, the results of polis as a grouping dimension. But you could think of any other dimension. Could be family relationships, could be gender, and but the assumption of this model is for the properties to hold is that actually you only gather the relevant grouping dimension. But what are the relevant grouping dimensions? We go a little bit deeper into this assumption in the analysis to show you what actually a violation of this assumption does to your results. And the second crucial assumption is that let's assume you have the relevant grouping dimension. Let's say organizational affiliation determines who's in a group or not. Even then, you need that there's no misreporting of relationships, or there's no, in other words, no network information missing. Like can be either due to misreporting or that just data is missing from grouping dimensions. And let's actually first dive a little bit more into the second assumption here to see what a violation of this thing actually does to your results. So, and you can rephrase this problem as what is if the protocol like doesn't capture the true network state? To evaluate this is, so we just simulate a network and let this network define the relationships between agents and call this network the true network in a theoretical sense. And then if we have a true network and we gradually remove relationships between these agents in a network, we simulate the situation where you don't capture all the network information, either could be due to misreporting or that it's just missing in reality. You not always have access to the whole network. And then basically what we do is we calculate these probability scores using the true and the networks with missing relationships and just compare. For simulation, we use, like in this case, a classical random graph model. We use for the illustrating purposes, we use 100 agents, and these agents have a probability of 5% to make a connection with each other. Just to illustrate, if you simulate this graph, it looks more or less like this, where we define if there's an edge between these nodes, these agents, then they are in the same group. Furthermore, we just assume that every agent in this network would vote 10. So because we want to isolate the effect of this network information and don't want to get it biased by different amount of votes that people might have in this network. So basically, under this assumption, you can basically calculate the probability score of the true network. It's 207. To put it into perspective, it would be here. So on the x-axis, we have the share of removed edges. So if I remove 0% of edges, I have the true network on the bottom left side. And then I calculate the mean probability score over 100 iterations of the same simulated network with 0 removed edges. So just to avoid the fact that my random graph model generates so different networks that basically to average the effect, to average out the effect. So, and what you see is, if we go to the other extreme, if I move 100% of the edges in the network, then there are no grouping relationships. Basically, what you see here is the dot here is quadratic voting. That's what quadratic voting would give you as the other extreme. So what you see is, as I remove edges here, 10%, 25%, 50%, 70%, 80%, 90%, up to 100% of edges in the network, my probability score that I get decreases. And actually, if I have, if I have a lot of missing information in the network, then it's almost as if it's similar to the quadratic score. So the more valid my information in the network is, so the more not the more valid, the more complete my information in the network is, the more the plurality score or COCM actually has a bite and can change the result. If I have missing data, then maybe I shouldn't use COCM. So that's the first takeaway. So takeaway, so the plurality score here heavily depends on the available information about agents' pre-existing relationships, as we just showed in this very little example. And this missing information can actually invalidate the collusion resistance property of the CSOM model. So if I have missing network information, I cannot use this network information to make valid groupings, to use these groupings to then determine to avoid collusion between these groups, because I actually don't know the real groups. Further evaluation here is needed to show that the difference in the plurality scores due to the partial network is robust to change the parameters of the model that I used or the model itself. But this little example illustrates quite well the problem that you have as an implementer when you want to use a grouping dimension to identify any grouping dimension to identify who is in the same group. You need good data. And if you don't have good data about it, maybe implementing simple quadratic voting is better than plural voting. Then the other thing is I told you that if you collect grouping dimensions, let's now assume the network information that you collect about the grouping information, about the groupings that you choose is complete. Let's say if I choose organizational affiliation as a grouping dimension, I have complete network information. But what is if that is not the only relevant category? What is if there are multiple relevant categories? Or what is if I just add categories? Like I could add gender as a dimension, I could add academic credential as a dimensions. What is if I add dimensions? Because just I have the data which are complete, but maybe some of these dimensions are not relevant to the vote. What I'm actually doing to the vote, and how we simulate this is that we actually use the same technique as before. We just generate, in this case, the normal random graph as the base case, and then we just add networks on top of it generated by the same graph model as reflecting a different grouping dimension and see what we get. And actually the result is here, if you take the standard model, is that I mean x and y axis is the same, that actually here you produce a level change. And actually this is what Rich mentioned further. That's actually a problem in the model that we discovered while implementing it, because the model has the mathematical property that if you remove all the edges, if there's no grouping dimension, you should always get the quadratic score, right? If there's no grouping information, the model should converge to quadratic voting. However, it's not the case if you add multiple grouping dimensions, because what does the extreme case here reflect? It reflects that you have one network here where everybody's in his own group, so to speak. So there's no links, so no grouping. So everybody's in his own group. But you have another network where everybody's in his own group as well. And you have a third network where everybody's in his own group as well. So that means you have basically, you say like, okay, I'm in group 1, but I'm also in another group 2. So I have 3 groups where I'm the only one in there. Shouldn't it be the case that I should be just counted as one group? Because what can I learn from me being in one group to comparing to me being another? Are they different groups? And actually that is a decision an implementer of such an experiment really needs to take into account. When I have multiple grouping dimensions, what is considered actually as a group? What we did is, like, if we can identify these duplicates very clearly, like I have 2 different affiliation, but it's just me having this affiliation, then I should be only considered as one group, and there's nothing to learn from me being in one affiliation and me being in the other affiliation. So therefore, in the extremes, we reduce this extreme case back to the model and made the model consistent with it. That's kind of an improvement that we did for the model. But still, in the middle, I don't go more into detail. You have still some edge cases about duplicates. It's not very trivial. So you have actually, when you have multiple grouping dimensions, you get like you can get into a problem of duplicates, and which is not very trivial. Yeah. So the takeaway here is if you need to be very careful about how many grouping dimensions you choose. On top of that, you need to ensure that you have complete data in these grouping dimensions for them to have bites. Another thing that we did is and actually that is related to when we had the first presentation here back in August of the July. If you remember, we had like a little experiment where we asked you, should expertise, for example, be weighted, and how should it be weighted? Should it be considered in such a model, and if so, how much should it be weighted? Basically, we analyzed the results, and basically what it shows is that the vote basically shows that, for example, what I mean with expertise. First, let me say what I mean with expertise. Like, for example, you could imagine that should we give PhDs more vote powers than masters, than people with a bachelor degree, right? That was kind of the question. And actually, for these expertise weightings to matter, to outperform the kind of square root in theorem formula, they needed to be very large, but on these levels we couldn't find any agreement in the votes, for example, that we did. So basically, what like weighting by like giving different vote power to different kind of categories of people, this dimension is something that I think you shouldn't necessarily do if you're implementing the COCM model. Basically, our suggestion is that you give basically everybody the same vote power, because you already have to deal with the grouping dimension problem and the network information problem that I showed you before. And just the takeaways. So adding multiple grouping dimensions breaks the property that the quadratic scores maximum score as duplicates are possible. So actually, that is something, if you just implement vanilla COCM as it's written in the paper that I cited, and it's also the citations in the presentation, you run it, you actually break the model. And actually, we found that we probably should make an edit to this paper, or write the authors to implement this duplicate strategy, because it's actually a problem of the model that we found during the summer protocols. And adding multiple grouping dimension implies that the implementer of theory must make a decision about which dimensions fit together. So we, in our experiment, decided to go for organizational affiliation and research groups and policy groups, but to test that and to get the data, but are these dimensions like valid? Like, is somebody who has this organization affiliation should if does he have something similar with somebody who is in a different research group, and vice versa? It's not very clear, so you need to be very careful here. And then let me go to polis in our experiment. Rich mentioned earlier that we implemented polis. And we basically implemented to stimulate some discussion around MLB and generate a second grouping dimension to power our COCM model. At that time, when we implemented it, we just said we basically just thought we can add as much dimension as possible as the model itself allows for it. And basically, during this process, we learned about this shortcoming, actually discovered this duplicate problem. And basically what it did is participants submitted these controversial opinions about MAB on registration. And we used these statements to seed kind of the polis, and then polis basically struggled to generate these groups. And when it did, most participants disagreed about membership assignment. So there was discussion actually about polis hey, why is the group like this? Why I'm in this group? Why I'm in that group? Because Polis so what went wrong? Polis basically is a very easy interface from the outset. You receive a statement, and the thing what you can do is I vote agree, disagree, or pass on this. Then I get the next statement. So from an interface perspective, from a UI perspective, it's super easy. But what goes on behind Polis is not so easy. It's very complex actually, and that basically and people have us not providing sufficient information for people to understand what is going on behind Polis in the workings actually generated all these questions, and then in the end turned out to confusion. So basically, participants voted on these statements, and then they were grouped into these opinions groups, which you can see here, like an illustration of it, according to their voting patterns. I mean, in general, Rich mentioned earlier, Polis is like a success. It has been used in policy making, and it's also used worldwide in national and local levels to inform policy decisions. So it's a software that is used. But when we looked into this more deeply, it is very complex what is actually going on. So you need to decide what should I see to statements to Polis. Should I moderate these statements or not? How are statements routed to participants? Which order are statements that are already seeded, and new statements has come in shown to participants in which order? Then participants vote, and then comes another complexity: how are these votes then analyzed? And this is in this red square, which I just illustrate the complexity of it here. So basically, people vote, and then there's a dimension reduction algorithm applied to flatten kind of these vote metrics, to be able to get into two-dimensional space to then get the final results. But to like first, you can have several mechanisms to do this dimensional reduction, and different mechanisms would lead different results. The only reason to get it into two dimensions is because then you can apply like a clustering algorithm that puts you actually nicely. In this case, they use it's k-means clustering by default, that puts these that generates these grouping the mechanisms. But you can imagine other clustering definitions. But the biggest problem I want to actually talk about is that most of these algorithms cannot handle missing values. Let's say in the case of the Taiwan experiment, let's say if 2,000 people have to vote on, let's say 100 statements, I vote on, let's say 7 statements, and I don't vote on 93, missing values of these 93 needs to be handled. And basically what was been done by default, this model was interpolated using the average, but I voted on 7 and 93 of my answers were interpolated, can lead to centering, and that's the central problem. But and like how to handle missing values is alone like a huge topic in the literature, but that just illustrates how complex this mechanism is and how many decisions go into generating such results. And we think that this not understanding of the what's going on behind the scenes actually led to the confusion in our experiment. Rich, do you want to take over from here again?
Thanks, Ben. You'll have to stop sharing. Oh, that's fine.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're running short on time, so I'll try and zoom through the rest of this as quickly as possible. But I was, as a result of using Polis and then looking into why it failed, I was drawn into looking into other instances of Polis, and I particularly looked at the UK where I live, and identified 46 different implementations of Polis and more than a dozen service providers that will help you to spin up a Polis instance. And investigating these, we could only find one implementation which deviated from the default calibration, and that was because I talked to them and suggested that they might want to look into it. And it's not like the default is necessarily wrong, but it's also not necessarily right either. And it's sort of worrying that there are very few instances of people actually investigating how these inputs are transformed behind the scenes, which is really where all of the magic of these plural mechanisms actually takes place. We might have to zoom through this pairwise quadratic voting very, very quickly, but this is another mechanism which tries to use data that's like intrinsic to the voting mechanism to generate the discount rather than having the implementer decide which identity data to use, which seems to be the source of all these problems. And so this is like quite a neat idea that you can just use voting records. Basically, you would see how everyone voted on all the previous issues, and then you would discount based on these correlations. And while it's neat, it's not clear that this is very desirable either. At this point, it's really not clear what the correlation represents, why you would necessarily want to discount it. And in fact, we started, but weren't necessarily able to get that far with a partial study into DAOs and what would happen if you tried to use pairwise QB, because DAOs have a lot of voting data available. Oops, let's go back. Sorry, how I go back. But the problem is that you just run into the problem that the DAOs have all this correlated voting data. There's lots of abstention. Basically, most DAO votes go 95% in favor or against. There's a lot of delegation, which also accounts for huge amounts of correlation, and you will just find that there is a reason why everyone was correlated. The agreements, most of the votes were for quite obvious things, for busy work. But the problem is then when a contentious vote comes along, the DAO is even more vulnerable to attack, because everyone who has previously voted is going to get discounted because they all voted yes on quite boring things like setting parameters that have been agreed. So while it's interesting, I think there needs to be a lot more work into how that might work practically. Overall, we sort of, like we said at the start, took a very broad approach, but I think there are some shared takeaways. Plural mechanisms are extremely novel and powerful and appealing, but they're very easy to miscalibrate, which leads to suboptimal outcomes. Although the consequences of this are generally low, if people want to use them more, which they seem to, like in more high stakes contexts, I think there are going to be risks associated. Although they seem to be very transparent, these mechanisms, because often the inputs and outputs are published, they're open source, people that are implementing them are very vocal and honest about their trying to be transparent. The actual magic of how these mechanisms work is often extremely opaque, and it can be opaque to the creators, the implementers, and the participants. And if you are an implementer who wants to do something pluralistic but isn't necessarily an expert, it's not clear that you can rely on service providers to really provide you the advice that you need to implement something optimally. Solutions to lots of these issues do exist. A lot of these are like the case of matching the right statistical peg to the right hole, but at the moment, our analysis suggests that they're not necessarily finding their way to the right mechanisms, but hopefully that will improve as more people come into this field. We have started to produce some guidelines, and my goal will be to publish those within the coming months. As I said at the start, I don't want to be too down on pluralistic mechanisms. I think there is a lot of, I'm maybe not sharing correctly, but let's try that. Sorry, that's better. There is a lot of promise here. I just think that we are in a situation where there are a lot of people theorizing, there are a lot of people experimenting and building things very rapidly. There isn't a lot of what Ben and I have done, which is sort of quantitative analysis of whether these are actually being successful for reasons intrinsic to the mechanism, or just because they're sort of cool and new and people are just excited to try them. I think with a bit of thought and care, though, it will be quite easy to eliminate these low-hanging fruits and make them a lot more powerful, and help people to pick the correct mechanism for their context and probably think about their context. Just want to finish up with some future research for stuff that sort of we touched on, but didn't have time to look into. AI-assisted plurality. Obviously, everyone's excited about AI. Most of the service providers I looked at were offering AI-assisted analysis of results, but they seem to be using pretty vanilla LLMs. And my intuition is that the way LLMs work and the way that plural mechanisms are supposed to work are quite at odds with each other. One is trying to surface unusual, surprising results, and LLMs really tend to smooth that out because of their probabilistic nature. Delegation and plural voting, like liquid democracy, is interesting. We had a good story by Randy in the pill section. It doesn't. These delegation and liquid democracy mechanisms don't necessarily play very well with plural mechanisms because they smooth over all the relational identity data by making everyone into one voter. I think there are, again, interesting ways these could interact, but at the moment they seem to interfere. And the last thing that is super interesting is decentralized plural governments. A lot of the problems we identified are that implementers have a lot of decisions to make and they have a lot of power. Ideally, the participants would also be the implementers, but how can you safely modify and calibrate these plural mechanisms to ensure they can't be captured and they properly remain plural? We've had some thoughts there. One hope is that we've modified the tool to provide a bit of a sort of game experiment that we'd hope to run over at Edgelana in Thailand, that we hope everyone would participate in a sort of Mars colonization simulation, which we think is a scenario which can demonstrate some of the pitfalls and hopefully highlight some of the solutions. That's it. Sorry, we overran a bit, but there was a lot to get to. A few minutes for questions if people have any.
Yeah, nice job, guys. If people have questions, go ahead and raise your hand. We got time for a few. Oran's got one.
Hey, really great. I can't say I understood everything, but I think I'm getting a gist of fixing some really core issues with voting stuff. One question I had is, and this is kind of a pet peeve of mine with tests in general, is how the question is worded is often the last, especially in science stuff, that is not even considered. It's it's a question, it's a question. So I'm curious, what is the effect of the question writing, the phrasing itself on a system like this? I think you guys said there's a lot of complex knobs, but I'm curious how that would impact the what are you, a X or a Y, and also Z kind of thing.
Oh, you mean the identity? Yes, you mean for gathering the identity data? Yes, I mean the COCM in particular is fraught because it requires you to set these group boundaries that people just may not agree on where they fall, and as you say, the way that you phrase the question to gather that data may affect the groupings that you get, which in turn will affect the rankings of the results. All I say is, yes, that's important. Again, it's hard to design an experiment that would test that, because you can't really set that question to two groups of people, two groups of participants, which are then comparable. And you can't ask the same group of participants two versions of the same question and expect them to forget their answer. And then if you try and sort of A/B test it, that also causes problems. The problem with these plural mechanisms is they treat every individual as a special flower, which is great, but then it makes it very, very hard to put those individuals into separate, comparable, double-blinded experiments or tests or other things. It's just hard, which isn't a very satisfying answer, but it is a good point.
but let me just add to it, because this question, right, highlights exactly the problem of these pro voting mechanisms, right? You, with collecting this identity data, right, you buy yourself that you mitigate or even solve the civil issue that the quadratic voting mechanism has, but at what cost, right? Because you need to make decisions about all these points, like you just mentioned, and you might run into several other problems, right? Yeah.
Dorian, you got a question?
Yeah, I'm curious the extent to which like agent-based simulations would help suss out like the structures and pitfalls and failure modes of this kind of voting. Like, you know, you set up your simulated bunch of agents and then you just have them have preferences and see what happens under certain configurations. Like, to what extent are you doing that kind of analysis?
We haven't. That was outside of our scope, but I agree that is a useful approach. I am not aware of people that are, like I said, people are using AI agents to like run through these tests. Like I think to sort of.
I mean, I'm not talking about AI agents though. I'm just talking about agent-based simulation. Like you just have, like you could do an R.
No, sure. But people are using these approaches to, I think, to test their implementations, whether they like practically work. But there doesn't seem to be any of this. Not that we've identified. We can identify much quantitative analysis at this level of these mechanisms. But yes, that would be a useful approach for further research into this.
Okay, guys, I think we're a few minutes past the hour here, so good time to wrap it up. That was a great presentation. People in the chat were clamoring; they want the slides. So,
I will share the link on Telegram. And
okay.
Thanks, guys. Sorry that overran. I suddenly got very sleepy.
Yeah.
One quick question for organizer stuff. I feel like there's a bunch of discussion stuff that would be awesome. I'm curious at an offline if there's a space for that. So thank you.
Yeah, there is the forum, which we have, and then there is also a Telegram chat. I'll send a link to both here. Thanks everybody for joining. We've got another talk. This was the fourth one. The fifth one is tomorrow, same time, same place, on autonomous realities. That's going to be pretty far-fetched and interesting. And I hope to see everybody there.